quite often for these entry-level roles, they're not looking for a lot of experience because you don't have experience. So what becomes more important for these entry-level roles is this cultural capital piece. But knowing these unspoken or implicit rules quite often becomes as important and sometimes more important than just your skills and abilities quite often.
More than ever, inclusive hiring is a priority for organizations. But these initiatives don't always work as intended. Strong candidates are frequently overlooked, and if they are hired, they don't stay at the organization long term. Why does this happen, and how can well-meaning organizations do better? Welcome to the Delve podcast, where we bring you the latest leadership and management insights from the Desautels Faculty of Management. My name is Saku Mantere, and today I will be talking to my colleague Jeraul Mackey, an assistant professor in organizational behavior here at McGill University. So today I'm talking to Professor Jeraul Mackey, who's a recent addition to our strength here at Desautels. So Jeraul has a PhD from Harvard, did a postdoc at UC San Diego afterwards. And Jeraul has looked into inequality in very interesting ways. So today we're going to have a conversation about cultural capital and inequality in hiring, basically. So Jeraul, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Saku.
What made you interested in inequality in the first place? You know, it seems that's one of the key themes for your research.
So my interest in equality, I think about it through two lenses. So the first lens is just I grew up in New Orleans, went to public high school my entire life. And I remember this moment, my dad had got laid off from his job. And it was one of those moments to see him search and look for other work where what I knew was someone who had, from his perspective, had worked offshore for over a decade, really struggled to find another opportunity, or what seemed like struggle to me as a high school student. And that was one of the first moments where it sort of dawned on me that you could have these sets of experiences, you could be able to do this job, but that doesn't always translate into getting the roles or the opportunities that you feel that you've earned or that you have the skills for. Much more recently is that once I finished my master's at Harvard, I went and worked and I did executive recruitment. And as a recruiter, I would find myself in these moments with hiring teams, with executive leaders who are saying at the start of a search, we want to hire someone who expresses our commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. It might not be something that we've been successful at, but we want to sort of put our mark on the ground and say that this is who we want to hire. And while that would be the case at the beginning of the search process, towards the end, communities would end up with someone who looked like folks who were in the firm. How did we get someone who is much more consistent with our culture and who looks like us when we wanted to hire someone who might have been a little bit different? So those two moments really, for me, was a reflection of we have this sort of tension, you will, or maybe this disconnect between, from a supply side standpoint, thinking about job seekers who want certain jobs, who feel as though they have the skills and the qualifications and are not getting hired. But you also have organizations who, from their perspective, are also having this same thing that they're grappling with. We want folks who are from diverse backgrounds. We want individuals who can bring new or complementary perspectives.
There's this institutionalized way of speaking about job candidates when you meet in the committee that hires that. Do we like this person? It was common lingo to talk about liking a job candidate. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of a loaded term, isn't it? So it brings in a lot of baggage, in particular if we're talking about diversity. How would you react to that?
One of the things that you will notice that is something that plays out across a variety of hiring contexts. So within the context of consulting, for instance, that is often is translated as the airport test. Is this someone who, if there's a snowstorm in Chicago, I feel comfortable being stuck in an airport with them for several hours? So this idea of like, in your right, Saku, it introduces this notion of bias. we hire folks not solely based and sometimes not at all based on their qualifications to do the job, but we may hire them based on this cultural matching process. As Lauren Rivera talks about in her book Pedigree, you play squash, I play squash, I like you because we can probably play squash together, which might be different from can you do the job function as articulated within the posting.
So how does what you call cultural capital play into the dynamic that you're just describing about liking and cultural matching?
There's institutionalized cultural capital, there's embodied cultural capital, and then there's objectified cultural capital. In institutionalized cultural capital, just a shorthand to say that your degree has value over and above what you might have learned in school. So it's saying that you got a degree from Harvard or an Ivy League institution, individuals might give you the benefit of the doubt or some quote unquote unearned privilege within a labor market. When I think about much of the work within culture capital and how it relates to hiring, what scholars often focus on is this idea of embodied cultural capital. So how you dress, how you talk, your level of comfort, interacting with adults or authority figures like a hiring manager or a teacher. Certain individuals, because of their sort of background and their upbringing, might be much more comfortable interacting with the manager, might feel quote unquote more at ease within the interview process, sharing their background, for instance. And for some individuals, that might be a little bit of a struggle for them. They may see the interview as it's my job just to come in here, articulate my ability to do the job, and not worry about some of these
fitting in.
About fitting in, about some of these interpersonal pieces. Part of what I tried to add to that within my research is thinking about this role of objectified cultural capital, which we might think of as sort of the products of the job search. So if you write a cover letter, you may think that the cover letter is your opportunity to express your interest in this position. But a hiring manager might also evaluate that same cover letter, not just as an expression of your interest, but maybe as a writing sample, maybe as a way to evaluate how does this person communicate their ideas and put together a narrative of a story of why they might be a good fit for this position. So part of what I try to look at in my work is that how do we think more about these quote unquote objectified forms of cultural capital that could shape hiring decisions.
So there's this confidence that you are equipped with, in dealing with asymmetric power relations, I suppose, that, you're able to be more autonomous and goal-directed when in a social situation, when you have this certain type of confidence. You know how to handle yourself, you know how to dress, you know how to behave in a dinner table, all these things that come with, I suppose, with class. Bourdieu also talked about taste, that you have the proper tastes. We can see how this is immediately relevant for inequality, perpetuating inequality in hiring situations, right?
These are things that are in many ways unrelated to the skills and ability to do a job. But it's things that we know, it's things that are very much legible that you can see and interpret and make particular judgments about individuals. There's a sociologist named Jessica Carlarco who refers to these distinctions as strategies of influence or strategies of deference. So do you defer to authority figures or do you treat them as really equals in a way and have strategies of influence in terms of how you engage them for your own ends?
So you could maybe say that's almost like managing up. If you do get hired, then those skills are going to be very helpful in managing up, managing your own bosses.
I'm glad that you've mentioned managing up, because part of what I think about in my work is that how do we think about cultural capital within the context of young people, of recent undergraduates who are moving out into the world. And one of the things that you typically learn on the job, depending on the context, is this idea of managing up. that you have to communicate up to your manager, let them know what you're doing, let them know what you want them to do in a way that can, if you're not familiar with that, can feel odd, uncomfortable, not your job. But as you a little bit allude to, it's something that can be effective if you want to move up within the organization. There's somewhat of a corollary to that is individuals who see work as work. If I want to move up, I just need to keep my head down, do a good job, and let the work, quote unquote, speaks for itself. That's one perspective that tends to be less successful than individuals who may realize the work can't speak for itself. It's my job to communicate it, to let folks know what I'm doing, how it's having a contribution on the organization as well.
Yeah, and it is funny you should say that, because I just had a conversation with our colleague Henry Mintzberg about strategic thinking. And so we're talking about how in contemporary organizations, there's less and less space for strategic programming, where you would tell people what job they need to do and then leave them to it. And there's much more demand for people to be aware of the consequences of what they're doing in the context of a bigger whole.
We're expecting individuals a little bit, what we might call sort of down the organizational hierarchy, to have that level of strategic thinking. So for instance, if you are working at a call center and you get a client on the phone and they has an issue, what you're articulating is that we don't expect you to just read the script. There's an expectation that you can understand their issue, and the goal is to resolve the issue. So the difference now is that it's not just your managers or your senior leaders who need to have this level of strategic thinking, but are we also expecting that for folks who are junior within the organization, who might be in entry-level roles, individuals who may not be people managers but have some control over providing solutions, if you will, to your clients or your customers.
So there's also, a foreseeable outcome that you do hire people who bring in that diversity, but then they're basically, dead in the water because they're not heard. Their messages are not understood or picked up on.
They may come, not be successful, and leave. They may come, not be happy, and stay. Both of these are not the ideal outcomes we would want for workers in the labor market.
In your research, you talk about the thank you note that you send after the interview, motivation letter. Could you tell me a little bit more about why you find these objectified forms of cultural capital, the objects of cultural capital, so to speak, so fascinating?
I looked at two organizations who are hiring for these entry-level positions. And to their credit, these were organizations that had a pre-existing commitment to what we would call diversity, equity, and inclusion. And there was two things that hiring managers were really keen on once they identified that this is my top person, this is who I want to hire, this is who I like in many ways. And the first thing that they would key in on is what can almost feel like this innocuous question. Saku, you're great. We know you can do the job, but where do you see yourself 5 years from now? And the catch about this question is that it's not related to the current job. We know you can do that. It's not related to whether or not I like you or not. I know I have this cultural match or this connection with you. And some candidates would answer that question honestly. I like this job, but I maybe can see myself going back to grad school in a few years. That was not the right answer.
Okay, yeah. I can see how that could be a bad idea, yeah.
Hiring managers would hear that answer, and it would make them nervous to extend an offer, and more often than not, they would not extend the offer. This person has answered you honestly. What did you want them to say? And very consistently, they would talk about this idea that whether it is true or not, I want to hear job seekers say, this is where I want to be. This is the job of a lifetime. I can see myself growing within the organization. It's a script that, irrespective of who the candidate is, they're expecting you to repeat this script back to them. And I remember I was talking to a recruiter, and I said, but what if that's not true? And what a recruiter communicated to me is that, well, it's less about it being true, because going back to the idea of cultural capital, it's not the idea that I'm looking for a truthful answer. The cultural capital piece is that I'm trying to see if you understand the subtext of the question. And the subtext of the question is, can you communicate to me that you understand that I'm looking for some reassurances that I'm not going to have to do this hiring process a year from now, that all of the resources in it that I invest in you won't be for naught because you're going to go back to grad school or leave and go to another company.
What would you tell a recruiter that would be really keen to bring in more diversity into their workforce, and sort of how would you advise them to do their work differently?
Part of what I encourage recruiters to do and hiring managers is to make the implicit rules explicit. So for instance, if it is the expectation of that candidates write a thank you note, is there a way for recruiters to communicate that to job seekers to say, hey, typically your first interview in an organization with a recruiter is just based on skills and qualifications. Can you do the job? But having recruiters communicate that there's a few things that we might expect for you as you move on into the next round. Research us, have some good questions ready for the hiring manager, and after the interview, make sure that you follow up and communicate in ways that feel comfortable to you. Then you can really level the playing field, because now everyone ostensibly has some understanding of what's expected for them to navigate the hiring process.
All of us are also constrained by our cultural capitals. How can recruiters become more aware and open of these limitations that we have?
What was my aha moment is that when I'm interviewing someone who is also extroverted, I have to have a level of awareness of what are the ways in which I'm giving them the benefit of the doubt because they sort of really play into my own disposition and sort of personality, if you will. And then if someone might be a bit more reserved, what are the ways in which I might actually be overly critical of them because they are more reserved or might not be as expressive? That level of awareness is important for any recruiter to have this sense of, when I'm interviewing folks who come from backgrounds or have sets of experiences that are different from mine, how am I aware of that when it comes to evaluation and who I look at in terms of who can be successful? Part of what I also think that recruiters can do is expand what they see as the sort of evidence of qualifications. And I'll give you an example of that. So what that can look like, for instance, I remember I had a conversation with a recruiter who was asking a candidate, are you good juggling different deadlines? How do you work under pressure? The typical answer that we would identify as sort of evidence of qualifications is, I worked on a group project, being full-time at my school is taking 3 credits. I took 4 credits, and here are the grades that I got, and here's my work on a group project. That's pretty standard sort of evidence of qualifications. But there was one candidate who says, I have 4 little brothers, and I help my mom manage them. So they have to get picked up from school. We have to make them dinner. So if you look at just my academic record, I may not have the best grades, but I know how to multitask. I know how to put a work plan together, and I know how to manage those experiences. Seeing that as credible evidence of your qualifications and being able to manage multiple projects is something that all recruiters might not be legible to our recruiters. So expanding our sense of, what are the sort of evidence or qualifications could be another way to try to make sure that we're not letting our own personal biases or the way we see the world shape who we hire and sometimes who we might penalize for being different.
Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel laureate psychologist, he one of his early studies was about recruitment, and they found that job interviews typically didn't predict performance on the job at all, and the only way to make them a bit more reliable was to repeat the exact set of questions to every job candidate to make sure that you don't, give up on those questions because you feel that you've connected with the candidate and you want to sort of,
And what you're really speaking to, Saku, is this idea of having a structured interview. So this idea that you ask everyone the same question. And what that is really effective at doing is letting you know, is the process fair? Are we treating everyone fairly? Something that I observed in my research, and this is why I go back to the idea of sort of expanding our sense of what is sort of evidence of qualification, is that quite often we have a structure for how we ask the questions, but we may not have a structure for how we assess the questions. And being able to have a structure on assessment can sometimes be more critical than the structured, having the structured interview process. And what I mean by that is that you may ask me, give me an example of how you had to manage multiple projects. If one person pulls from their academic life or their professional life, and another one pulls from their family life or their personal life, if we don't have a clear sense of what it looks like to evaluate someone who's drawing on these sets of experiences, we might rank them a little bit lower than someone who's drawing from something that feels more comfortable than us. We understand group projects. We understand what it's like to manage different deadlines. We may not have a clear frame or sense for understanding what it means to help your mom or help your parents manage your siblings.
Jeraul, as my last question to you, I would like to be a bit unfair maybe, because this is a very demanding question, but this fascinates me, and your perspective on this fascinates me. So how can we get that supply and demand to meet in practice? What are you excited about in terms of developments towards a more equitable workplace and a more diverse workplaces?
What do we already know works? If you want a diverse pool or you want a diverse organization, you need to have targeted recruitment. For instance, you need to have mentorship programs that are in place. Much of that is within the literature. What some of these organizations that I studied would say is that we've done a great job of recruiting a diverse pool. So folks are attracted to our organization. But what we're trying to figure out is that how do we evaluate folks fairly? How do we have our own capacity so that we know what it looks like to evaluate folks in a way that lets them go through the process? And then part of where I think we started at also, Saku, is that, well, once they get in the organization, then that becomes the cool thing. How do we get them to stay if that's what they want and to grow within the organization as well?
Jeraul, thank you so much for joining us. I've really enjoyed this.
Same here. It's been a pleasure.
And that's today's show, folks. Thanks for listening. If you liked what you heard, please tell a friend about the Delve podcast and don't forget to subscribe. Delve is a thought leadership platform for the Desautels Faculty of Management of McGill University. This episode was mixed by John Tracy and Dicaire. Original music by yours truly, Saku Mantere.